There's no surprise today that at the beginning of 2026, we're paying closer attention to the geopolitical change. It's getting complicated already. Not only in China and also in America, across the continent, people are very anxious about the direction for many countries. But while we look at what's happening right at this moment, and also it's crucial for us to examine the history. And we know for decades that we've been addressed the issue of slavery for so long. Of course, this is something that from the historical perspective, it's undeniably important and critical as we look at what's happening at this moment. And lately, there are so many amazing books came out and regarding the issue on slavery and also why it's even more essential for the younger generations to understand the historical context and also allow us to continue our discussion. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Miss Carrie Gibson. Miss Gibson is the author of the 3 works of history, and she's the author of the book called The Great Resistance, The 400-Year Fight to End Slavery in the Americas. And prior to gaining a PhD in history at the University of Cambridge in 2011, she worked as a journalist for The Guardian, an observer in London, and she's currently living in Seoul, South Korea. And again, Ms. Gibson, and welcome to The Missing Piece, and congratulations to this amazing book.
Thank you so much. It's a real treat to be here today.
Absolutely. I am very excited about our conversation. Now, I want to get started. As I mentioned before, it's a well-researched book, especially on the issue of slavery. It's not just about what happened in the past. In the book, you actually elaborate in a very deeper way. And I want to read something to you that you wrote in the book, and I want you to get your reaction on this. This is what you wrote, and I quote, "With this focus in mind, I have 2 main goals in this book. And first, to provide a wider vista to think about this shared history of the hemisphere, North and South, and its implication. And second, to mediate on the meaning of the freedom by tracing the thoughts and actions of those who were the least free, those who had to fight," end quote. Ms. Gibson, from your perspective, as we're looking at the complication of the geopolitical change, and again, as I mentioned in the intro, undeniably speaking, slavery has been a crucial topic, not only for the past, but also for the present and even to the future. But right now, what are we writing, or what are you writing about, especially you talk about this tracing the thoughts and action of those who were the least free and those who had to fight? Your thoughts?
So I wrote that. I'll start with the second part first, and then I'll answer the first part. So with this book, the reason it's called The Great Resistance is what I try to do in it is talk about the people who fought against slavery, who were enslaved or descendants of the enslaved. I try to center the book on their experience rather than the experience of white abolitionists, who have been given a lot of time historically in the past and a lot of space. William Wilberforce in Britain, or Abraham Lincoln in the US. And this time I'm trying to kind of flip everything on the head and go, well, actually, what did enslaved people do and how did they fight for freedom? And, what did that look like across time and space? And one really important thing that I kind of discovered in putting this whole sort of mosaic together was that social change takes a long time. I think we really, in this very speeded up age, we want everything fixed straight away. And what's so compelling about this story is that enslaved people, fought against their slavery from the inception of the transatlantic slave trade. So you have people fighting on the coast of Africa. You have people jumping overboard to their death from slave ships, or having a rebellion on a slave ship. You have later bigger revolts like the Haitian Revolution, but you have a fight from the get-go. In the world of 1700, in the Americas and in Western Europe, nobody was really, beyond the enslaved, were thinking about the end of slavery. Like, it wasn't even on the radar. And then by the 1880s, it's completely gone. And even by the early 1800s, you're starting to see the end of the slave trade. You're starting to see gradual abolition in certain places. It is beginning to finally go away. And in some ways it sounds like a disheartening lesson, but on the other hand, I think the really powerful part of it is that, we're never going to return to this system. There is absolutely still human trafficking and slavery in other forms, but the form that we saw, this very specific form of enslavement, has been abolished. Now, the afterlives and the question of racial justice and that sort of thing has absolutely continued, and it's very much part of the discussions that we're having today, just in terms of what's going on in the United States and a lot of the rest of the world. But there's a big story in here, I think, about the persistence over time to make absolutely fundamental change in society. So I think that was a really important lesson. The other thing, to kind of go back to the first point about the wider vista. So this book attempts to bring together a story that goes beyond the United States and Britain. And so I look at Brazil and Cuba and all the places where, enslaved Africans were taken in the New World, and so that goes hand in hand with colonialism as well. And so the reason I do this is because I think a different picture emerges. And I do think there's kind of a Hollywood version of slavery that kind of sits in the popular imagination. So people think of like films like Gone with the Wind or 12 Years a Slave. And it's very much about the US system and how these things played out and how people resisted them. Is very diverse over time and space. So for instance, in 1835, there was a big revolt in Salvador de Bahia in Brazil of people who were Muslim, enslaved people from West Africa, but a Muslim part of West Africa. So, again, like that's not really part of a well-known story like other sort of revolts, at least in the English-speaking world, because I also wanted to bring together these linguistical divides. A lot of the existing history is divided by language, so a lot of the scholarship in Brazil is in Portuguese. I mean, not all of it, but you know what I mean. Part of this book was to bring it together. But what I'm also trying to do here, and I do in my previous book, which is called El Norte, and that's about the Hispanic past of the United States, is make the argument that United States is a Latin American country. It's formed out of, it has all the same characteristics. It was formed out of European colonialism. It had indigenous genocide. It had African slavery. And yet the United States really treats itself quite differently. And of course, the way it treats its neighbors and people who are from those countries is a huge current issue. And so, again, this book just sort of builds on that, like kind of challenging American exceptionalism in terms of its history. I mean, sure, there are things about it that set it apart from its neighbors, but there's things about every country that, there's a reason Canada's the way it is. There's a reason Mexico's the way it is. But the thing that the entire Western Hemisphere has in common is this history of European colonialism, indigenous genocide, and African slavery.
Well, again, Ms. Gibson, it's fascinating for you to talk about, again, slavery. It did not just take place in America. I mean, again, that your book covered a variety of the countries and spread of the continent. But I have to say that as I trace the steps or the history according to your book or the content in the book, correct me if I'm wrong, one thing, or should I say one word that came to my mind is the word authenticity. So in other words, there had to be something, like you mentioned before, fundamentally truthful about the history that we can't deny it. Or there has to be something so genuinely worth discovering that you documented in the book. But I want to bring another word into our conversation. Again, it really echoed what you said, is the word rebellion. I mean, you wrote that rebellion, large and small, and other acts of resistance that were less dramatic but no less powerful, were a steady drumbeat through this fight for freedom, marking time through long, difficult history. I mean, oh my God, what can we say about the word rebellion? I mean, again, if we look at what's happening right now in the States, in Europe, and in the Middle East, I guess the definition for rebellion is beyond our imagination. I mean, it's just too descriptive. But in the book, talk about the history of slavery, talk about your research. How would you define that? And also, why was that critical when we talk about the history of slavery, when we talk about the controversy of slavery, when we talk about rebellion? Your thoughts?
So with this book, yeah, I try to look, as I was saying, I try to kind of focus on rebellion and on resistance because that has been overlooked. But I do give a kind of a picture, because you have to kind of understand how the system was built before you see it dismantled. And so I do try to give a kind of broad sweep of like, well, how did this happen? You know, how did we go from the Portuguese in 1444, you know, to Brazil in 1888, you know, via the U.S. Civil War? Like, you know, how does this, all of this unfold? And it's a very big epic story, and it also intertwines with you know, the rise of of modern capitalism. There's a lot about the system that we would recognize. So there was insurance was developed to insure cargoes. You know, there's very things that are now part of our modern life that come out of this early period. So, you know, we're talking sort of 18th, 17th century. Some of these sort of innovations, they're actually in service to this new and growing trade. I want to kind of touch on the point you made with authenticity, and I think this is that's really interesting that you kind of chose that word, because I think this is part of accepting an authentic history of the Americas. You know, the pushback about talking about slavery, and as you may or may not know, recently the U.S. government has started taking down historical information markers like. In Philadelphia, they've taken some down. There
That's
has been
right.
sort of edicts about language and edicts about, you know, what kind of history can be presented. But this is an authentic story, not only to the United States, but to the rest of the hemisphere, because, you know, we know this happened. And to say, you know, everybody should just get over it. It's in the past. It's not. You know, the things that remain are parts of the fabrics of every country in the Americas. So yes, I mean the kind of racial injustice of the United States is particular to the US, but not something unfamiliar to other countries. There's a lot of racism, there's a lot of colorism, you know, throughout the Americas. There's a lot of gun violence. There are a lot of things that are not unique to the United States. And it is part of the fabric, you know, it is what it is. It's part of the fabric. And the better we understand it, you know, the more we understand it, the more it can be worked through. And people, you know, rather than the conversation being shut down and saying, well, that was a long time ago. It really wasn't. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888. That was almost the 20th century. And then to kind of answer your question about rebellion. So that's one thing in this book, is that I hope I kind of covered most things. Because you have multiple levels. And I think this speaks to today as well. You have multiple levels. You have straight up conflict. You know, you have a group plotting a revolt and carrying it out and burning down plantations and taking the guns and going to the next plantation and setting some sugar on fire and taking the guns. And you have absolute revolts. But you have a lot of other things. And as I mentioned a minute ago, you know, you had people fighting on the shore of Africa. You had people jumping off slave ships. You had people, I mean, and some quite really sad, you know, incredibly tragic things, like people killing themselves, people killing their infants so they wouldn't have to endure a life of slavery. You had poisonings. I have a bit about poisonings in there. You have, you know, people sabotaging things. You have people running away and self-emancipating. And this forms a fair bit of parts of the book where you get communities of people who ran away, and they were known as Maroons. And that comes from a Spanish word of cimarron, and it kind of gets changed into English into Maroons. And these are people who self-emancipated and lived in quite remote places. And in certain circumstances, certainly in a lot of the Spanish Empire, but also in the British Empire, across all of them, but very specifically with the Spanish and the British, some of these Maroon communities were so powerful that the colonial officials just had to do a deal with them. So the Maroons in Jamaica basically were in a war with the colonial officials for about 10 years. And finally, in 1739, they did a treaty. They said, okay, fine, we'll leave you alone. You just have to catch any other runaways and return them to us. You know, There were a few kind of provisions, but otherwise, we'll just leave you be. And in Jamaica today, there's descendants of maroon communities. There's still people who live in maroon communities and have active links to that past. In the Spanish Empire, very similarly, I read about 17th century Panama, 17th century Colombia. You get these communities, and they can't suppress them. It's just the terrain is too difficult, or there's not enough soldiers, or these people are very good fighters, and the people who self-emancipated, and especially in that early period, they may well have been warriors who had been captured in a conflict in Africa, so they were going up against people who probably knew what they were doing, and so communities were able to take root, and again, the Spanish crown kind of had to find a way to legitimize it. So that's an enormous power. But one of the things that's very paradoxical about it is the price they paid often in these maroon communities was to capture other runaways, was to, in theory, aid the officials when they needed it. And that was the price they had to pay for their freedom. And these kind of paradoxes also emerge in this book, because if the whole world is ensconced in this system, this slavery system, then people will do things that today, to our minds, seem very unfair, paradoxical, to keep their freedom. So you also have things like enslaved people might be arrested for a conspiracy, for a revolt, and the person who went to the officials and ratted on them was another enslaved person, but they got their freedom. You get stories like that quite a lot, and you just think, well, that doesn't sit with how we think about this period. And it's like, right, because at that time, some people were willing to do anything for their freedom, because that was the system. In the same way that some people say they were able to buy their way to freedom, which you could do in the Spanish and Portuguese Empire. There were kind of systems by which you could save money and go to court and kind of buy your freedom, and then you could buy enslaved people, because that's how you made money. That's how you grew capital. It's also a way to possibly save family members, or loved ones. Like it works in many ways, but again, to our modern eyes, it seems a little strange. Like, well, why would people who are now free or descendant from enslaved people buy slaves? And it's like, but that was the world everybody was living in, and so we have to accept it on the logic of its times, even though it seems very confusing for us today.
Well, of course, Ms. Gibson, there's no contrast between the past and the present. I mean, again, we understand that we always say people are the product of the environment. I mean, when we are put under special or unexpected circumstances, that, in a political way or in this economic way, that we tend to say a desperate moment demands desperate measure. I mean, that's the way for them to survive. Correct me if I'm wrong if I say that. Now, two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about 2026. It's a crucial year for America. I mean, again, not only for the political reason, but also it celebrates the 250th anniversary. But again, we look at some of the founding fathers. They were slave owners. And for some of them who did not even willingly to let go of the slaves on their deathbed. No. I mean, we can think about a lot of names. But the question to you, Ms. Gibson, is why do you think that today, when we study the history of Americas or American, the part that those founding fathers who stood together, fought for the freedom, the unity of the country, but other people tend to overlook the fact that those people who did not have the will to let go of the slaves or to unleash the slaves within their homes or, whatever you call it, why is that still difficult for people to comprehend at this moment? I mean, we can't just talk about independence. We can't just talk about 1776. But meanwhile, we have to talk about another perspective, the truth. So that's why I would say, going back to the point, is the word authenticity. You can't deny that because it happened and it written in the history and documented in history. Why is that still so difficult for people to accept it, even in a more reluctant way? What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely a big issue because yeah, the majority of the founding fathers, or certainly a good deal of them, were slave owners. And in fact, many, I want to say, I read some really staggering statistic. I think only 5 people in the first 20 were not slave owners or from slave owning families. The first 25, but don't quote me on that. But there's something kind of a quite shocking statistic that it was rife. And I mean, in some ways, I puzzle over it as much as you. It's like, I don't understand why we can't accept this and go, okay, so you had a group of people who crafted this constitution and who did these things, and they were living in a paradox. So how can we now understand the United States? How can we understand the relationship between freedom and slavery, as written by these people? But instead, I think earlier generations, put them on this sort of pedestal. And also, you have to remember that especially in the kind of the case of the US quite specifically, it had Jim Crow, it had a social apartheid as well. And I think that colored a lot of the sort of production of history and how people thought about this past. But yeah, like I'm very much of the nobody's a hero, everybody's a flawed human school. I mean, yes, some people meet their moment and they are brave and they show great leadership, or they're, brilliant tacticians, but ultimately they're people and they live in all of us live in contradiction, right? All of us. So it's this deification. It's going to just be dreadful, I think, this year. It's going to be really hard to watch, this sort of sainthood kind of cast onto this group of men. And it's like, they weren't, and if we can accept that and talk about how they weren't and the contradictions in their life, and then go, okay, so these things, these principles, this stuff that is supposed to, these ideas that are supposed to guide the nation, are they still valid? Do they still work? How should we think about them, given that they were cast in this period of enormous contradiction, right? The language, it's so fascinating in this period, in the American Revolutionary period, because there's such a rhetoric about the white colonialists being enslaved by the king, by the crown, by the system, and they use the language of slavery, and that is again, just at that time when you're sort of reading things, you just think, wow, this is wild, because there are actual enslaved people, but you're using that language to describe your kind of political relationship with a monarch across the ocean. And so I think it's really, really important for how we think about freedom, and, why this has been such a stubborn part of US identity. Why can we not just have a national conversation that goes, yeah, this is how it was, and these are the conversations we need to have. It becomes Thomas Jefferson's a hero, you can't criticize them, or, it's woke to criticize George Washington, and that's not true. I think you can have a rational discussion about these things. I'm not sure what that discussion is going to look like in 2026, given the climate. But the other thing I will say is that there's a story that, and this is me this is stuff that kind of came up in my other book, but I will talk about briefly because it connects, is, the Hispanic past included a really important campaign in Florida and Mississippi, led by Bernardo Galvez in sort of 1780, 81, that was super important for the American Revolution, completely written out. Everybody loves it, the French helped. And it's like, the Spanish helped. And also there was a lot of smuggling of arms and stuff from Spanish traders. And it's interesting because I've been invited to contribute to a few things in Spain about the Spanish contribution. And it's like, what's going to be the conversation around that? Because we're at the same moment, there's so much antagonism from the sitting US government towards the places that helped the United States, towards the descendants of the people who helped the United States at that moment. So I'm curious to see what will kind of arise that recalls, the part of of the Spanish Empire and Hispanic people in securing American, freedom from Britain. So yeah, we'll see.
Well, again, Miss Gibson, it's a great conversation. Oh, that's why I will say we can't deny what happened in the past. And we need more people to understand the truth, and also through literature, through reading, like your book, and really understand what happened and to explain and to identify the issues that we're still facing today. Well, Miss Gibson, I do want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, the book is called The Great Resistance, the 400-year fight to end slavery in the Americas. There you go. That's a book.
Brought my copy.
There you go.
And it's, I will just say, I'll interrupt you briefly just to say it's available. It's available in the US and US platforms, so like Amazon and what have you. And then it's out in Britain and Commonwealth on the 12th of February. So you should be able to find a copy of it somewhere, hopefully.
Definitely be on the lookout. So, Miss Gibson, I want to ask the last question is, what do you expect the readers to understand and appreciate when we finish reading the last chapter of this book? Because again, you dedicate so much information and it's not easy to understand at once. Right. But I do want to know that you have certain expectations, especially for the younger generations, who are still in the midst of political confusion, in this historical ambiguity. So putting everything together, final thoughts. What do you expect the readers to understand and why? Final thoughts.
So I wrote this book in a chronological style because I wanted to take the reader with me through this journey. And so I think the thing that I want the reader to take away, especially one who's not very familiar with this topic, is to get a sense of how long this lasted, how long the struggle was, and why we're still living with the afterlife. Now, I don't go too much into that in the epilogue because I want to focus on, the book kind of ends with the end of slavery in Brazil. But, I sort of muse a bit about things as a way of conclusion. And I do want people to think about that connection. It's like when we look at the moment that we're in now, what does this very big story tell us? How can it inform the way we think about today? And I think there's a lot in there that will really surprise people. And I think this kind of scale is one of those things. But also, the persistence of people to just keep at it, just to keep going. And I think there's a really important lesson in that as well. And as we try to make sense of the modern world and we try to protect the freedoms that we do have now and things like that, I think there's a lot to be learned by the people in this book, some of whom, were never even named in like colonial documents and things like that. So some people we just only have glimpses of. And think about, how a lot of history is sort of, it's a conversation, but it's also kind of a cumulative effort. And so we can see where we are now, we can turn around, we can look back and we can go, oh, okay, now I understand one of the roads that got us here. Because there's a lot of other roads, but this one, is a pretty big one, an important one. And so I hope the reader comes away with the sense of, oh, right, this all kind of makes a lot more sense now.
Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, such an honor to speak to Miss Carrie Gibson. And again, as she mentioned before, be on the lookout and check out this amazing book, The Great Resistance, the 400-year fight to end slavery in the Americas. Well, Miss Gibson, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'll love to have you back on the show for future episodes. So thank you so much for doing this.